The Secret Service didn't want him to stop, but through the trees, past that sagging fence line, Trump saw something that made him pause. A flash of movement in the shadows of an old barn, a figure standing perfectly still, watching. When he got closer, the man didn't run, didn't hide. He just raised his hand in a crisp military salute. Who he was, and why a sitting president would spend the next 3 days moving heaven and earth to find him, wouldn't make sense until the whole story came out. Before we dive in, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever felt invisible despite everything you've given, hit that subscribe button. You're not going to want to miss this. The barn had given up fighting sometime between the last snowfall and the one before that. Its roof sagged like the shoulders of an old man who'd carried too much for too long, and the red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, peeling off in brittle flakes that scattered in the wind like memories. Most folks driving the back roads of Kansas wouldn't have noticed it at all. Just another piece of the past, slowly being reclaimed by the earth. But Jack Reeves wasn't most folks. He'd been living in that barn for going on 6 years now, ever since the day he walked out of the VA office in Topeka with nothing but a manila, folder full of contradictions and a growing certainty that the country he'd served had somehow misplaced his name. The place wasn't much: 4 walls, a leaky roof, and a dirt floor that turned to mud whenever it rained hard. But it was quiet. And quiet didn't ask questions about where you'd been or why you'd stopped talking about it. Jack's world had been stripped down to what actually mattered. A military cot in the northeast corner, positioned so he could see both the door and the window without moving his head. A wool blanket, folded with the same precision he'd learned 24 years ago in basic training. A steel footlocker that had followed him from Fort Bragg to Kandahar and back again, scratched and dented, but still solid as the day he'd first stenciled his name on the side. And hanging from a bent nail on the wall, a faded army jacket that still smelled faintly of desert dust and diesel fuel. He didn't have electricity, didn't have running water, didn't have a phone or a computer or any of the things that connected people to the world beyond these 4 walls. What he had was discipline and muscle memory, and the kind of internal clock that had kept him alive in places where morning light might be the last thing you ever saw. Every day started the same way. Eyes open at 05:30, no alarm needed. Feet on the floor, hands rubbing the sleep from his face, then the daily ritual of checking his gear. Boots laced the regulation way, beard trimmed with a knife he'd carried since his 3rd deployment. Jacket, brushed clean of dust and hay. He didn't need a mirror to know he was ready. He could feel it in his posture, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands hung naturally at his sides. The people in the nearby town of Millerville had long since stopped trying to figure him out. At first, there'd been the usual small town curiosity. Old Mrs. Patterson from the general store had driven out twice with hot meals and questions about where he'd come from. Sheriff Kowalski had checked on him a few times, just making sure he wasn't causing trouble or planning to cause any. Even Pastor Williams from the Methodist Church had made the trek out to the barn, armed with pamphlets and good intentions. But Jack had a way of being polite without being welcoming, respectful without being chatty. He'd take the food with genuine gratitude, answer the sheriff's questions with yes sir and no sir, listen to the pastor's words with the kind of attention that made it clear he wasn't rejecting the message, just the messenger. And then he'd nod once, step back into the barn, and close the door with the finality of a man who'd said all he had to say. After a while, they stopped coming. Not out of meanness, but out of something that felt like respect. He wasn't crazy, wasn't dangerous, wasn't the kind of broken that needed fixing. He was just finished, done with explanations and small talk and the endless dance of civilian life, and somehow that quiet dignity earned him a kind of peace. They called him the Ghost when they talked about him at all, but they said it. The way you'd talk about a local landmark, with familiarity and a grudging kind of admiration. Inside the steel footlocker, Jack kept the only things that proved his life before the barn had been real. A flag folded into a perfect triangle, its edges still sharp enough to cut. A photograph, creased from being unfolded and refolded 1,000 times, showing 6 men in desert fatigues with their arms around each other, grinning like they owned the world. And a bronze star, with a V for valor still in its case, still untouched by anyone except the general who'd pinned it to his chest in a ceremony he could barely remember. He didn't open the footlocker often, maybe once a month, when the silence got too heavy and he needed to remember that John Michael Jack Reeves had once existed in official records, in morning reports, in the memories of men who'd trusted him with their lives. But most days it was enough to know the box was there, solid and real as the ground beneath his feet. That morning in October started like all the others. Cold air seeping through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying the smell of frost and dying leaves. Jack had been up since before dawn, walking the perimeter of the property the way he used to walk the wire back in Afghanistan. Not because he expected trouble, but because some habits die harder than the men who made them. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, working a knot out of his bootlace, when he heard them. Engines, multiple vehicles, moving slow and deliberate, down the county road. The sound made something in his chest tighten, not fear exactly, but awareness. The sharp kind of attention that had kept him breathing through 3 deployments and a dozen firefights. Jack stood up slowly, walked to the door, and looked out through the crack between the boards. 3 black SUVs, government plates, windows, tinted dark as midnight. They'd pulled off the road about a quarter-mile down, near where Old Man Henderson's fence line met the county easement. From this distance, he could see figures moving around the vehicles, but he couldn't make out faces or details. He didn't run, didn't hide, didn't reach for the pistol he kept wrapped in an oilcloth beneath his cot. He just stood in the doorway, shoulders square, hands relaxed at his sides, and waited to see what the day would bring. President Trump had been in a mood all morning. Not angry exactly, but restless in the way that came from too many meetings and not enough fresh air. The veterans' event in Topeka had gone well. Good crowd, good energy, the kind of authentic moment that reminded him why he'd run for office in the first place. But now he was trapped in the motorcade for the 2-hour drive to Kansas City, watching cornfields roll past his window, while aides briefed him on the next round of budget meetings and policy reviews. When the call came over, the radio about the traffic backup, Trump actually smiled. Interstate 70 was completely jammed. A semi had jackknifed near Lawrence, and traffic was backed up for miles in both directions. The Secret Service was recommending they take Highway 24 north, then cut through the back roads to avoid the mess. "Entirely fine by me," Trump told his detail chief. "Maybe we'll see some actual America instead of just asphalt." The detour started off pleasant enough. Rolling hills, farmland, the kind of scenery that looked like something off a postcard. Trump found himself relaxing for the first time all day, watching hawks circle overhead while his driver navigated the narrow county roads with practiced ease. Then they hit the pothole. It wasn't just a bump in the road, it was a crater left. Over from the last hard freeze, deep enough to swallow a basketball and twice as wide. The lead SUV hit it at exactly the wrong angle, and the sound that came from the front tire was unmistakable. Not a slow leak, a blowout. The convoy pulled over in a cloud of dust and muttered curses from the Secret Service. They were stopped, on a dirt shoulder beside a fence line that looked like it hadn't been mended since the Eisenhower administration. Beyond it, maybe 100 yards through a thin line of trees, sat an old barn that looked ready to collapse under the weight of its own neglect. Trump stepped out of his vehicle to stretch his legs while his detail set up a security perimeter. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the smell of turned earth and wood smoke from somewhere off in the distance. He took a deep breath, feeling some of the tension leave his shoulders, and that's when he saw it. Movement. Just a flicker in the shadows of the barn doorway, there and gone again, like a trick of the light. But Trump had good eyes and better instincts, and he knew the difference between a shadow and a person trying to be one. "Sir," Agent Morrison said quietly, "we should get you back in the vehicle." But Trump was already walking toward the fence, his attention focused on that distant doorway. As he got closer, the figure became clearer. A man standing perfectly still in the shadows, watching the convoy with the kind of calm alertness that didn't come from curiosity. "It came from training, sir," Morrison said again, more urgently this time. Trump raised a hand to quiet him, then called out across the distance, "Morning!" The response came immediately. The man stepped forward into the light, tall, lean, grey-bearded, wearing an old army jacket that had seen better decades. And then he did something that made Trump's breath catch in his throat. He saluted. Not a casual wave or a friendly gesture, but a real salute, the kind that had been drilled into muscle memory until it became as natural as breathing. Clean, crisp, held for exactly the right amount of time before dropping back to his side. Trump stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of that simple gesture settle around him like a heavy coat. He'd been saluted thousands of times since taking office, by Marines at ceremonies, by generals in briefing rooms, by honor guards at state dinners. But this was different. This was personal. He climbed over the fence. "Sir," Morrison hissed. But Trump was already walking across the field, his dress shoes slipping slightly in the soft dirt. The man didn't move as Trump approached, didn't speak, just stood there with the patience of someone who'd learned to wait for orders no matter how long they took to come. When Trump got close enough to see his eyes, pale blue, steady, carrying the kind of weight that came from seeing too much, he stopped. "What's your name, soldier?" "Jack Reeves, sir. Master Sergeant, retired." The voice was quiet but clear, with just a hint of the South in the vowels. "How long were you in?" 24 years, sir. 3 deployments, special forces." Trump glanced. Around the inside of the barn, taking in the Spartan living conditions, the military precision with which everything was arranged. This wasn't a homeless encampment, this was something else entirely. "What happened?" he asked, and the question came out gentler than he'd intended. Jack was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, there was no bitterness in his voice. No anger, just a kind of weary acceptance that hit Trump harder than any accusation. "Could have. I got lost in the paperwork, sir. Retirement got processed wrong. Benefits got tangled up. Appeals got buried. After a while, I figured it was easier to just step away." "How long have you been out here?" 6 years next month. Trump felt something cold settle in his stomach. 6 years. A decorated Green Beret, living in a barn because the system had failed him so completely that disappearing seemed like the only option left. "Do you have family?" "Had a wife. Cancer took her about 8 years ago. No kids." Jack's voice didn't change, but Trump caught the way his jaw tightened slightly. "She used to say I'd figure out how to fix it. The benefits, the paperwork, all of it. But some things can't be fixed, just endured." Trump pulled out his phone and stepped away, speaking quietly to someone on the other end. Jack couldn't hear the words, but he could hear the tone, sharp, urgent, the voice of a man who was used to giving orders and having them followed. When Trump came back, his expression had changed. There was something harder in his eyes now, something that looked like barely controlled anger. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer," Trump said. "Are you willing to let me try to fix this?" Jack met his eyes steadily. "Depends on what fixing looks like, sir. Full reinstatement, back pay, benefits, housing if you want it, and a personal guarantee that the people who let this happen will answer for it." For the first time since Trump had approached, Jack's composure cracked slightly. His Adam's apple bobbed once, and he had to clear his throat before he could speak. "I didn't ask for this, sir." "I know," Trump said. "That's exactly why you deserve it." They stood there in the doorway of the old barn, two men from completely different worlds, connected by something neither of them had expected to find on a dusty back road in Kansas. In the distance, Trump could hear Agent Morrison calling his name, but for the moment all of that seemed very far away. "What do you say, Master Sergeant?" Jack was quiet for a long time, looking out across the field toward the convoy. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out something small, a faded photograph, creased and worn from handling. "These were my boys," he said, holding it out for Trump to see. 6 faces grinning up from the picture, young and confident and alive. 3 of them didn't make it home. The other 2, I lost track after I fell through the cracks. If you're serious about fixing things, I want to make sure it doesn't just stop with me." Trump took the photograph, studying the faces of the young soldiers. When he looked back up, there was something different in his expression, something that looked like respect. "It won't stop with you," he said. "You have my word." Jack nodded once, slowly. "Then yes, sir, I'm willing." As they walked back across the field together, neither of them noticed the freelance photographer who'd been stuck in the same traffic jam, who'd taken a different route to avoid the backup, who'd spotted the motorcade from the ridgeline and pulled over to see what was happening. Neither of them saw him raise his camera and focus on the barn. Neither of them knew that the moment Jack had saluted his commander-in-chief, that single gesture of respect and recognition had been captured forever, but within 24 hours, the whole world would know. The photograph hit the internet like a lightning strike. No context, no explanation, just a single image. A man in an old army jacket standing in the doorway of a collapsed barn, hand raised in salute, while another figure in a dark suit stood respectfully in return. The morning light caught the edges of the scene in gold, and something about the composition, the dignity in the soldier's posture, the reverence in the other man's stance, made it impossible to look away. By noon, it was everywhere. The photographer, a freelancer named David Chen, who'd been trying to make a living covering Kansas politics, had posted it to his Instagram with a simple caption, "Somewhere in Kansas. Sometimes honor doesn't need words." He hadn't known who either man was when he took the shot. He'd just seen something that felt important and pressed the button. Within 6 hours, the image had been shared 10,000 times. By evening, it was trending on Twitter under 3 different hashtags. News outlets were calling Chen's phone every 5 minutes, offering money for the story behind the photograph, but Chen didn't have a story. All he had was that one perfect moment, frozen in time. And then the internet detectives went to work. It started on Reddit, where a user called VetWatch47 enhanced the image and cross-referenced it with satellite photos until he found the exact location of the barn. Someone else recognized the military bearing in the saluting man's posture. "5th group, definitely," wrote retired SF Doc. "Look at the way he holds his left shoulder. That's an old paratrooper habit." A genealogy enthusiast named Patricia Williams found an old deployment photo from Iraq that had been posted years ago in a VFW newsletter. 6 soldiers, arms around each other, grinning under a blazing desert sun. The face of the man in the center matched the one in Chen's photograph, pixel for pixel. "His name is Jack Reeves," she posted. "Went missing from all official records about 6 years ago. Nobody ever said what happened to him." The revelation spread like wildfire. Veterans groups began sharing the post. Active duty soldiers started commenting with their own stories of bureaucratic nightmares and lost paperwork. Someone found a link to an old newspaper article about a Green Beret who'd received a Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded soldiers out of a burning vehicle while under enemy fire. The name in the article was J.M. Reeves. By the time the evening news picked up the story, Jack Reeves had become more than just a face in a photograph. He'd become a symbol of oversight, of bureaucratic failure, of all the ways the system could fail the people who'd given everything to serve it. The barn itself became a pilgrimage site almost overnight. Veterans drove from hundreds of miles, away just to stand where Jack had stood, to see the place where a forgotten soldier had been remembered. They left flags and flowers and handwritten notes tucked into the gaps between the boards. Someone hung a small sign on the door: Home of MSK Jack Reeves, 5th Special Forces Group, hero, forgotten, found. Meanwhile, Jack sat in a secure room at Fort Leavenworth, watching the world discover his existence with a mixture of bewilderment and quiet pride. The army had retrieved him from the barn the night after Trump's visit, not for his protection, the colonel had explained, but to shield him from the media storm that was coming. His possessions had been carefully packed and moved: the footlocker, the photograph, the bronze star he'd never talked about, even the old army jacket that smelled like memory and loss. Everything except the barn itself, which had already become something larger than the sum of its parts. Trump called him personally that first night. "How are you holding up?" the president asked. Jack was quiet for a moment, staring at the laptop screen where his own face looked back at him from a dozen different news websites. "I never wanted to be famous, sir." "You're not famous," Trump said. "You're finally visible. There's a difference." The next morning brought a stack of letters so thick it required 2 soldiers to carry it into Jack's room. Messages from veterans who'd faced similar struggles. Thank you notes from families of soldiers who'd served under him. Contact information from old friends who'd thought he was dead, but the letter that meant the most was written in a child's careful handwriting on lined notebook paper. "Dear Mr. Jack, my dad says you're a hero, and that heroes don't give up even when things are hard. I think you're brave, and I hope you're not sad anymore. Love, Emma, age 7. Jack read it 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it next to the photograph of his old squad. For the first time in 6 years, he felt like Master Sergeant Jack Reeves might still exist somewhere underneath all the silence and solitude. 3 days after the photograph appeared, he got another call. This one from a number he didn't recognize, with a voice he hadn't heard in 20 years. "Jack? Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead." It was Captain Ron Pierce, his old commanding officer from the deployment that had earned him the Bronze Star. Pierce was a full colonel now, stationed at Fort Campbell, and when he'd seen Jack's face on the news, he'd spent 6 hours calling. Every number he could find until someone finally put him through. "Sir," Jack said, and the old formality came back like he'd never left the service. "Cut that shit out," Pierce said, laughing. "We're both too old for protocol. Listen, I've got something to tell you, something I should have said 20 years ago." Pierce had never filed the recommendation for Jack's Medal of Honor. Not because Jack didn't deserve it, he absolutely did, but because by the time Pierce had finished the paperwork, Jack had already fallen through the cracks of the military bureaucracy. His retirement had been processed incorrectly, his records had been misfiled, and suddenly there was no Master Sergeant Jack Reeves in the system to receive the medal. Pierce had tried to fix it, had spent months fighting the paperwork maze, but eventually he'd been transferred to a different unit, then a different base, and the problem had gotten buried under newer, more immediate crises. He'd carried the guilt for 2 decades. "I've still got the recommendation," Pierce said. "It's been sitting in my desk drawer for 20 years, waiting for a chance to make things right. If you're willing, I'd like to submit it again." Jack was quiet for so long that Pierce thought the connection had dropped. "Jack, you still there?" "Yes, sir," Jack said finally. "I'm here." "So, what do you say? Ready to come back?" Jack looked around the room. Clean walls, clean sheets, clean clothes folded in a precise stack on the dresser. Through the window he could see soldiers moving across the parade ground. their movements sharp and purposeful in the morning light. For the first time in 6 years, he felt like he might belong somewhere again. "Yes, sir," he said, "I think I am." The ceremony was small, deliberately so. Jack had specifically requested no media, no crowds, no speeches about heroism and sacrifice. Just a handful of people who mattered, gathered in a simple conference room at Fort Leavenworth on a Thursday morning when the Kansas wind was carrying the smell of rain. President Trump was there, of course. He'd cleared his schedule to make the trip, much to his staff's dismay. Secretary of Defense Mattis had flown in from Washington. Colonel Pierce had driven up from Fort Campbell with a manila folder that had been waiting 20 years to be opened. But the person Jack kept looking at was the young man standing near the back of the room. Tall, serious-faced, wearing the dress blue uniform of a second lieutenant fresh out of West Point. Pierce's son, Liam, who'd grown up hearing stories about the sergeant who'd saved his father's life in a burning Humvee outside Kandahar. "I never got to say thank you," Liam had told Jack when they'd been introduced an hour earlier, "for giving me the chance to have a dad." Jack had shaken his hand and said simply, "You don't thank family." Now, as Secretary Mattis read the citation for the Medal of Honor, words about exceptional valor and selfless service and devotion to duty that sounded almost inadequate when applied to what Jack had actually done, Jack found himself thinking about time. How it moved in circles sometimes, bringing you back to places you'd thought you'd left forever. The medal was heavier than he'd expected. Mattis placed it around his neck with the kind of reverence reserved for moments that mattered. And suddenly Jack was 20 years younger, pulling Ron Pierce from a burning vehicle, while mortars fell like rain around them. He remembered the heat of the flames, the weight of Pierce's unconscious body, the certain knowledge that they were both going to die in that desert if he didn't move faster, push harder, ignore the voice in his head that said it was impossible. He'd saved 3 men that day. Pierce and 2 others who'd been trapped when their Humvee hit an IED. Jack had gone back into the burning wreckage 3 separate times, each trip more dangerous than the last, until everyone was out and accounted for. Then he'd collapsed from smoke inhalation and spent 2 weeks in a field hospital, refusing to let them medevac him back to Germany until he was sure his boys were going to be okay. The official citation called it conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life, above and beyond the call of duty. Jack called it Tuesday, after the ceremony, after the handshakes and the photographs that would never be released to the public. Jack found himself alone with President Trump in a small office overlooking the parade ground. "What now?" Trump asked. "The world's paying attention. You could write a book, do interviews, tell your story on any platform you want." Jack was quiet for a moment, fingering the medal that hung around his neck. Through the window, he could see soldiers moving across the grass, their movements precise and purposeful. Young faces, serious expressions, the same look he'd worn 25 years ago when he'd first put on the uniform. "I want to go back to the barn," he said finally. Trump raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because it's home now. And because there are other people out there like me, people who fell through the cracks, who gave up fighting the system because the system gave up on them first." Jack met Trump's eyes. That barn doesn't have to be a place where heroes go to disappear. It could be a place where they go to be found. 6 months later, the old barn looked very different. The roof had been repaired, the walls reinforced. The door hung properly on new hinges, but the changes went deeper than cosmetics. A small sign by the entrance read, "Reeves House, a haven for veterans in transition." Inside, what had once been Jack's solitary retreat had become something larger. A common room with tables and chairs, a kitchen where former soldiers gathered to share meals and stories, bedrooms for veterans who needed a place to stay while they fought their own battles with bureaucracy and memory. Jack still lived there, in a small apartment attached to the main building. But he wasn't alone anymore. There was Martinez, a Marine who'd lost his leg in Fallujah and his benefits to a clerical error. Thompson, an Air Force vet whose PTSD had cost him his job and his family. Davis, a Navy corpsman who'd been waiting 3 years for the VA to process his disability claim. They came broken and lost, carrying invisible wounds and bureaucratic scars. And slowly, carefully, with the patience that came from understanding exactly what they were going through, Jack helped them find their way back. Every morning at a 600, they gathered on the front porch for what Jack called morning formation. Not a military formation, just coffee and conversation, a chance to check in with each other and make sure everyone was okay. Sometimes they talked about their service, sometimes they talked about their struggles. Sometimes they just sat in, comfortable silence, watching the sun come up over the Kansas fields and remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than themselves. The president visited twice that first year, always unannounced, always without fanfare. He'd sit on the porch with the others, drinking coffee from a chipped ceramic mug and listening to stories that never made the evening news. Stories about courage that didn't come with medals, about service that continued long after the uniform came off, about the quiet dignity of people who kept doing the right thing even when the world had forgotten their names. "This is what I meant," Trump told Jack during his second visit, watching a group of veterans work together to repair a fence that had been damaged in a recent storm. "This is what service really looks like." Jack nodded, but his attention was focused on Thompson, who was teaching Martinez how to use a power drill with one hand. 6 months ago, Thompson had been sleeping in his car and considering whether life was worth the struggle. Now he was laughing at something Martinez had said, his face lit up with the kind of joy that came from feeling useful again. "It's not about the medals," Jack said quietly. "It's not about the recognition. It's about remembering that we're still soldiers, even when we're not wearing the uniform anymore." The barn, Reeves House, became a model for similar programs across the country. Veterans who'd been forgotten by the system found their way there, stayed long enough to get back on their feet, then went home to start their own versions in their own communities. The idea spread like ripples in still water, each circle touching the next, until what had started as one man's solitary refuge became a network of hope that stretched from coast to coast. Jack never gave interviews, never wrote a book, never appeared on television to tell his story. When reporters called, he politely declined and suggested they talk to the veterans who were actually doing the work of rebuilding their lives. When documentary filmmakers showed up wanting to capture the inspiring story of redemption, he sent them away with a gentle but firm suggestion that some stories were meant to be lived, not filmed. But on quiet evenings, when the work was done and the house was settling into sleep around him, Jack would sometimes sit on the porch with that old photograph of his squad. He'd look at the faces of the men who didn't make it home, and he'd whisper their names into the Kansas darkness. "We're still here," he'd tell them. "We're still taking care of each other." And in the distance, past the lights of the house and the voices of the men inside, the old barn stood silent and strong against the night sky. No longer a place where heroes went to disappear. Now it was a place where they came to remember who they'd always been. Jack Reeves never wanted to be famous. He never asked for recognition, never sought the spotlight, never demanded that the world remember his name. But sometimes the right story finds you anyway, whether you're ready for it or not. The barn still stands on that back road in Kansas, surrounded by fields that turn gold in autumn and green in spring. Visitors come through regularly, veterans looking for help, civilians wanting to understand, young soldiers eager to learn from someone who's walked the path before them. They don't come for photos or autographs. They come for something harder to define but easier to feel. They come for the quiet dignity of a place where service continues long after the saluting stops. Jack himself is grayer now, moving a little, slower than he did that morning when he first saluted a president in the doorway of a broken barn. But his eyes still hold that steady calm, and his voice still carries the authority of a man who knows what it means to lead from the front. He speaks at military academies now, not about the Medal of Honor around his neck, but about the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform, about how true service doesn't end when you take it off. The medal doesn't make you a hero, he tells young cadets. It just means someone noticed what you were already doing. And that photograph, the one that started it all, it hangs in the National Archives now, in a place of honor among the documents that define who we are as a nation. No explanation needed, no caption required, just two men recognizing each other across the divide between forgotten and remembered, between invisible and seen. But the real legacy isn't in any museum or memorial. It's in the lives that were changed, the veterans who found their way home, the quiet revolution that reminded America what it means to take care of the people who once stood ready to die for it. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you know who deserves to be seen, don't let it end here. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Legacy Valor, because there are more Jack Reeves out there, more stories waiting to be told, more heroes hiding in plain sight. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to stop and look. Sometimes all it takes is remembering that honor doesn't need an audience. Sometimes all it takes is a salute.